Thank you all so much. I want to thank the organizers of Race Before Race. I want to thank Leah Newsom and Terry Kessler for all of their work in bringing us together. And I want to thank all of the presenters yesterday and this morning and to come for so generously and bravely facing so much trauma so that we can learn from it, so that we can rise from it. My aim in this talk is to examine how the chessboard, as a material object and ludic concept, participates in processes of racialization in Shakespeare's Tempest and Lope de Vega's Servir a Señor Discreto, or To Serve a Lord of Discretion, both written around 1610 to 1615. The Sangre Ajedrez, or chessboard blood, in my title, is a coinage drawn from Lope's play, in which an astrologer offers this fortune to the young white Spaniard Girón: watch out, or you'll make a chessboard of your blood. It isn't until the play's final moments that Girón finally deciphers the prophecy. His amorous pursuit of and intended marriage to the enslaved mulata Elvira, he realizes, will culminate in mixed-race children, a bloodline of white and black. Last moments of the play, last 2 minutes of the play, the astrologer told me the purest truth, that if I have children, they will be chess pieces. They will be white and black. The play takes place in the Spanish city of Sevilla, which Lope elsewhere called the door and port to the Indies, and which during the 16th century was known for its large population of black Africans, both enslaved and formerly enslaved. Melchior de Santa Cruz's 1592 compendium of aphorisms, Floresta Española, is remembered today largely for its oft-repeated description of Sevilla. He writes of Sevilla that it looked like chess pieces, as many dark as white, because of the many enslaved persons in that city. In marrying Elvira, Girón realizes he fulfills the prophecy of Sangre Ajedrez within the chessboard city of Sevilla, an alternation of dark and light, controlled and made legible by colonial wealth. Miranda and Ferdinand's brief conversation over a game of chess at the end of The Tempest invites us to rethink the broad horizon of overlapping temporal and geographic histories evoked by the play's uninhabited island and its inhabitants. Sweet Lord, you play me false. No, my dearest love, I would not for the world. Yes, for a score of kingdoms you should wrangle, and I would call it fair play. The appearance of these lovers playing chess is a reminder that the play comprises a series of strategic moves to immobilize Prospero's enemy king, leave him defenseless, and check his power by canceling the tribute to Naples and reclaiming the title of the Duke of Milan from Antonio. What we see in The Tempest is the aesthetics of martial conflict abstracted into a game to be played and replayed by an increasingly skilled Prospero. The field is neither Milan nor Naples, and in the end, the pawns are restored, unharmed, to their king. If this is a chessboard island, however, The Tempest flouts conventions of fair play. Indeed, Prospero bends, breaks, and reinvents rules at will. This game of chess reveals how the colonizing project is enacted through a set of rules both established and ignored by the colonizer. Why these two plays? In short, because they both look to the West Indies, either directly or obliquely, and resolve their comic plots through a game of chess. Taken together, the plays conjure a Caribbean playing field, or battleground, upon which hierarchies of race, gender, and sexuality can be tested and reaffirmed. And the Boricua of the title is me, the daughter of a black Puerto Rican mother, who still struggles with this most basic question perhaps some of you also share. Why do I devote my career to dramatists that endorse, celebrate, and trivialize the violent subjugation of my ancestors? Let us take just one example, the cannibal, in case you all might want to get out your bingo cards, because now we have, I think, 2 talks mentioning cannibals. Neil Whitehead notes, our historical perceptions of the native Caribbean are heavily prejudiced by the distinction inaugurated by Columbus between the fearsome Caribes of the Lesser Antilles and the tractable Arhuaca or Taino populations of the Greater Antilles. The derivation of the term cannibal from the native terms reported by the Spanish, such as caribal, canibal, has often been noted, but the ethnic plurality this concealed was forgotten due to the European elision of such concepts for political ends. Colonial logic thus developed categories to distinguish between indigenous people who were deemed more or less likely to resist colonization. As early as 1504, Whitehead notes, Caribes had been juridically defined as any and all natives who opposed Spanish occupation in the Caribbean. The category Caribe thus served as justification for enslavement. We all study the past, but our expertise also gives us the tools to interrogate how and why these histories, these painful fictions, endure. Growing up in Bayamon in the 40s and 50s, my mother was taught that Cuba was populated by the descendants of cannibals, a story she was more than happy to share with her children. Actually, she was taught that Cubans were descended from the anthropophagi. And let me tell you, when she broke out the Latin, I assumed we were talking about scientific facts. When I started this project, I got tripped up over an inconsistency in these accounts, personal, as in my mother, and historical, as in the texts that I accessed through the research that I was trained to do. Perhaps you've noticed it. 16th century colonial accounts imagined cannibals overrunning the islands to the east of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is the one with the flag, it's mislabeled. But 400 years later, somehow the myth had hopped westward to Cuba. Who cares? It's all made up, right? You all know that. Except I found myself correcting my mom when we talked about my research. No, Mom, it wasn't Cubans who were the cannibals. I had to return to Aurora Levins-Morales' concept of medicinal history in her essay, The Historian is Curandera. She notes, in challenging imperial histories, some kinds of misinformation have more of an impact than others. Part of the task of the curandera historian is diagnosis. We need to ask ourselves what aspects of imperial history do the most harm and which lies are at the foundation of our colonized sense of the culture. The threat of the flesh-eating cannibal, whether from the west or the east, is one of those lies at the foundations of our colonized sense of Puerto Rican history. But it is also a lie that drives my intellectual investment in the uninhabited island of the Tempest. So too does my mother's maiden name, Sevilla. Silently alighting generations of violence and enslavement drive my investment in Lopez Chessport City. So let me get back to the only thing more thrilling in early modern studies than cannibalism, board games. Seated pastimes like chess, backgammon, and cards often appeared on the early modern stage as abstractions of dramatized seduction, violence, and political maneuvering. Game boards, or tables, were emblems of status and luxury across Europe, crafted from woods like chestnut, walnut, sycamore, and ebony, and inlaid with bone, including ivory, bless you, pearl, and lapis. Game boards often contain 2, 3, or 4 playing surfaces. This one includes a square board comprising 8 by 8 squares of alternating colors for checkers or chess, and a rectangular set of tables, look at this one, it's beautiful, for backgammon on the inside. Games were hierarchized relative to the prominence of skill versus chance. Card games and any game involving dice, for example, were viewed as morally and intellectually inferior to a game like chess, which depended entirely upon strategy. Chess is also, as Gina Bloom has noted, a game of perfect information, as it is played on a game board seen by both players and their spectators at all times. In game theory, games of imperfect information by design include chance, in the form of a roll of the dice or being dealt cards from a shuffled deck, and possibly strategies of concealment, keeping your cards out of view of your opponent, which is not really happening here, but there's a lot of other stuff happening here. Gives you a good sense of how people felt about cards in general. Although any of these games could draw wagers from participants or spectators, and they all did, games of imperfect information were more susceptible to loaded dice, trick decks, and cheating in general. The term fair play suggests a set of conditions under which all players have equal chance of winning and enjoying the game. In a game of strategy that rewards practice, like chess, players have no way of knowing whether they are evenly matched before they begin, and thus their individual competencies may disrupt the notion of what is fair. In this sense, unfair play might entail a stacked deck, marked cards, or complicit spectators, delegitimizing the player's equal chances at winning. The word unfair was not used in this way until the 18th century, however, and other antonyms for fair, foul, false, dark, and black, are even more illustrative of the attitude towards gameplay in The Tempest and Seville. In both plays, the game of chess represents the sublimation of women into colonial fantasies of white supremacy, fantasies that insist upon the subjugation of black women like Elvira and expect forfeiture from white women like Miranda. These plays do not share much in the way of action or style. In Lope's Comedia, a bankrupt gentleman, that's Don Pedro, and his witty servant Giron feign great wealth to pursue the wealthy Leonor and her enslaved maid Elvira. They run out of money and flee to Madrid, only to have a swashbuckling adventure with a wealthy count, the Lord of Discretion of the title, who rewards Don Pedro with the funds to renew his courtship to Leonor. The lady is saved from an unwelcome marriage to the wealthy but old Don Silvestre, and the play ends in anticipation of a double marriage. In The Tempest, of course, the exiled Duke of Milan orchestrates the action throughout, including the titular tempest that strands his enemies and the love plot between his daughter and the Prince of Naples. The plays do share a heightened awareness of imperialist world-making. In Lope's Sevilla, colonial wealth has had a profoundly destabilizing effect on the social order. Madrileños Don Pedro and Giron arrive in the chessboard city almost broke, but the characters from Sevilla are nearly all Indianos, a term used for white Spaniards who have returned to Spain after making their fortune in the West Indies. Leonor's father is Indiano, as is Don Silvestre, the man to whom she's promised, and she is an emblem of their wealth. Every time the two men meet to negotiate her dowry, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then in the end, it's at the exorbitant sum of 100,000 ducats. Referring to Elvira, Giron expresses his desire for a certain enslaved mulata, not from Sevilla. She is rumored to be Indiana. We later learn that Elvira's mother was born in Nigeria and her father in Lima. Spain, of course, is conspicuously absent from the Tempest's depiction of travel across the Mediterranean. But as I mean to suggest with my discussion of Caliban and Cannibal, Spanish colonial accounts of the 16th century Caribbean almost certainly shaped Shakespeare's play. Miranda and Ferdinand's flirtatious banter over a game of warring kings at first signals Prospero's victory over the enemies he has brought to his island. Yet Prospero's checkmate flourish is thwarted when the lovers are revealed just as Miranda accuses Ferdinand of cheating. The characters observing the match ignore this possibility, and like the wedding mask moments before, the game is interrupted and abandoned. Prospero continues rewriting the rules, reminding the audience that fair play will never apply to a game played within his sphere of power. Giron's realization at the end of Lope's play that the Sangre Ajedrez prophecy will be fulfilled by marrying Elvira and having children is played for laughs at his expense. When he first receives the prophecy, he's dumbfounded. He has no idea what it means and makes no connection between the prospect of chessboard blood and his desire for a black woman and the image of chess as a visual scheme for racial difference in Sevilla. He repeats, chess, I'll make chess of my blood, much to the frustration of the astrologer. I could imagine 2,000 ways to play it, he complains, but in this game of chess, I cannot win. When he asks Pedro for help solving this riddle, Pedro impatiently suggests if you just play the game, something good would come from it. And Giron responds, me? Chess? Me? Study? If you had said a few rounds of pintas, maybe. Pintas is like a wager-based card game. Giron does not know how to play this game, but he is bound to win nonetheless. Unlike Miranda, Elvira is never presented as her beloved's competitor, but rather his extravagant prize. Elvira is in fact explicitly associated with the design and expense of a luxury chess set. When Don Pedro praises Elvira, he begins by comparing her to her enslaver Leonor. My white star's cloud, my burning sun's shade, and concludes, well done, amen, to the knight who loved your mother, who inlaid ebony in ivory so well. Elvira's white father is here praised for his fine craftsmanship, as his union with Elvira's black mother joins ebony and ivory in the creation of a luxury good. Perhaps unsurprisingly, throughout the play, Elvira is typically identified only by her blackness and in sharp contrast to white Spanish beauty. Giron says he must consult Ethiopian muses to court Elvira because he says it would be inappropriate to invoke the Spanish muses in praise of her. At times, he expresses profound desire for her blackness itself as when he surrenders to a sea of ink in her arms. But like the other men in the play, Giron does not hesitate to speak of Elvira as vendible property. When he informs her, after 6 months of flirting, that he must return to Madrid, Elvira offers him her very soul. He bitterly responds that he could make more money selling her body, and perhaps make back some of the 2,000 ducats that he and Don Pedro have spent in their courtships in Sevilla. If Lope's notion of Sangre Ajedrez challenges paradigms of blood, bloodline, and the legibility of racial difference in the context of limpieza de sangre and inquisitorial epistemologies, Elvira's subjugation in Sevilla's gendered and racial order goes unchallenged. She is on the board, she is the board, but she can never make a move. What we witness at the end of The Tempest, however, is Miranda's forfeiture of a game she can win to secure an alignment with white supremacy. The lover's language is that of conquest, no less than the world for Ferdinand and a score of kingdoms for Miranda are at stake in their match. This cannot pass as romantic hyperbole on an island over which Gonzalo dreams of plantation and upon which Prospero enslaves both Ariel and Caliban. That the lovers, both born and poised to rule in Europe, freely wrangle for kingdoms and wager the world between them, suggests that the play is in fact engaged with specific histories of colonial competition, especially English campaigns against Spanish colonial forces in the Caribbean. Presumably, at least 3 characters in The Tempest are familiar with chess: Miranda and Ferdinand, shown in the middle of the game, and Prospero, who must have taught his daughter to play. Each represents a corruption of fair play within this colonial context. Miranda's line, when they are first discovered, contrasts fair with false. She says, "Sweet Lord, you play me false," a term used for, like I said, loaded dice and other forms of cheating and competition, but of course strongly associated with romantic betrayal. In the early 17th century, fair was commonly associated with visible beauty, symmetry, and attractiveness, in contrast to that which is foul or ill, as Miranda says in praising Ferdinand. There's nothing ill can dwell in such a temple. If the ill spirit have so fair a house, good things will strive to dwell within it. Of course, fair also denotes racialized whiteness and colonial ideals of beauty. Throughout Things of Darkness, Kim Hall argues that the language of fairness and darkness is always potentially racialized in 16th and 17th century English literature. In The Tempest, this is most powerfully illustrated by discussion of the marriage of the king's fair daughter, Claribel, to the king of Tunis. Sebastian places the blame for their catastrophic journey on Alonso's decision to marry his daughter to the African king over the objections of his white courtiers and fair daughter herself. Sir, you may thank yourself for this great loss, that would not bless our Europe with your daughter, but rather loose her to an African. You were kneeled to and importuned otherwise by all of us, and the fair soul herself weighed between loathness and obedience, at which end of the beam should bow. Prospero's version of fair play, by contrast, earns him the promise of fair issue by marrying his daughter to the Prince of Naples. The Tempest is thus only a game to the extent that the characters on the island believe, mistakenly, that attention and practice will result in a fair restoration of individual power. Prospero's daughter has absorbed this lesson. Miranda's accusation that Ferdinand is cheating is an assertion of the rules she has learned and practiced. But Ferdinand's denial, "No, my dearest love, I would not for the world," depends not upon her ludic competencies, but her ability to know what he would or would not do, knowledge not contained within her father's instructions. What might he have done to prompt Miranda's comment? Perhaps he picked up one of his own pieces, but then played a different piece, or silently swept one of her pieces off the board when she looked away. As a game of perfect information, cheating in chess requires taking advantage of an opponent's distraction to move pieces that will not be noticed. Miranda's accusation displays her ability to recognize where each piece belongs. If Prospero refuses to subject himself to the rules he enforces upon others, and Ferdinand cheats even after he has won the prize, Miranda's lines just before the game is abandoned demonstrate her complicity with the unfair versions of fair play advanced by her father and future husband. She both insists that Ferdinand was cheating and vows to deny what she has seen. Yes, for a score of kingdoms you should wrangle, and I would call it fair play. By linking a score of kingdoms with her promise to uphold his assertion of fair play, Miranda here signals her capitulation to patriarchal control as a gamble for colonial privilege. She must forfeit the game, but she wins dominion over a brave new world. When I spoke with my mother on Tuesday night about this paper, she found the phrase Sangre Ajedrez appealing, even charming, and set out to find a copy of the play. My reading of the play is that Lope romanticizes, sexualizes, and ennobles racial subjugation, but I'm not going to fight with my mom about it. This is the work of interrogating fair play in early modern studies. We must reveal the lies at the foundations of our colonized sense of the culture, in Morales' words. We must do so without draining all of our creative and intellectual and emotional energy, living and reliving trauma. I'll leave you with what I think is a brilliant example of this work in practice. Migration of the Gods by Afro-Cuban artist Harmonia Rosales. Here, the orishas of the Yoruba religion are carried to the Americas across the Middle Passage in the arms of enslaved Africans. As with much of her work, Rosales repurposes classical Renaissance painting styles. This piece may remind you of Michelangelo's depiction of the flood on the Sistine Chapel, to reaffirm the experience of beauty as a record of transcendence, of rising. I believe that attending to the painful and nuanced histories of intergenerational racial trauma demand that we cultivate, recognize, and celebrate the joy our ancestors dreamed for us. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Thank you, Ariane. That was beautiful. And as one of the Boricuas here, I'm like, it's the talk I didn't know I needed. Like, hey.
Y algunos dominicanos también.
Yeah. Hey, Caribbean representing, yeah. I think that your talk really was like something I didn't know I needed, right? Like sticking a finger in a scar I've had for a long time, right? Because so much of, I mentioned yesterday before my talk that reading Fanon, right, and an affirmation of blackness as the starting point for any kind of black revolution to be possible. Your talk has really reminded me as well of Toni Morrison's words, right? Like the job of what racism is really doing is distracting, right? It's keeping us from doing our work, keeping us justifying everything and everything over and over again. And as a colonized subject, right, still belonging to Puerto Rico, throughout your talk and this framework of fair play, like the idea that the illusion, right, that we can learn how to play the game and we will have a chance, but then the ground keeps shifting, the rules keep shifting when we get there. And I was reminded of my formation in the 90s and early 2000s in Puerto Rico, right, where we had this narrative, and it's really all about denying our racial identities, right, and kind of whitening it, right? And the Institute of Culture in Puerto Rico decided that the state-sponsored narrative was like, we are the best of three races, right? Like we are Christian like the Spaniards, we are good-natured like the Native Americans who gave the other cheek, right? And we are hardworking like the Africans, right? So that is what you saw in every history book in Puerto Rico at that time. And this kind of denial is really what kind of like struck to me and re-traumatized me, but perhaps now I can rise beyond it, right, throughout your talk. So perhaps there's no question here, but I wanted to thank you for this generous talk, and I think that the idea of a game itself to kind of like think through these is extremely fruitful and fertile ground for us to keep walking on. So just thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, for the live stream.
Oh, well, I have another plant over
I can
here.
be very loud. Yeah,
Thank
New
you
York
so-
and Art Club.
thank you so
That's me. Thank you again for a wonderful speech. And I couldn't help but think about also like the idea of chess being based on a game from India and the possibilities in the foreign, like the perception of chess as a particularly potent metaphor because of its foreignness to Europeans also, which also made me think of, and here's the question, in the work of Shakespeare that you presented, Shakespeare is when he uses chess as a metaphor, he's thinking of the characters in the play as pieces on the board, whereas you shared a bit from Lope de Vega, where a character expresses admiration for the workmanship of that mixing in the board of colors. And I was wondering whether you found that these dramatists, that the dramatists from Spain were approaching this idea of racial mixing and colonialism from a different point of view, or with a different attitude than the English writers.
A couple of things. One is, the first thing you brought up there, the actual history, the movement of chess, westward, essentially, and its impact on Spain, mostly first, and then throughout the rest of Europe. Every, great every great work of scholarship on games in the Renaissance says that's a great story for another time. And so I'm like, is that me? Is that me? Is that what I have to do? Because what we see is that history is then getting refracted into all of these different frameworks in Germany and in France and in England. And France had a lot in common, and then in Spain. And then slowly those then become frameworks for understanding racialization or become techniques of racialization. At least that's how I see it. With respect to the admiration that we get in Lope, that really seems specifically materially, maybe it's about another kind of furniture. There was a lot of that in ebony and ivory inlay in decorative furniture during that time period, but it certainly seems like this. We have so many examples of chess throughout the play, implicit as in the line that I mentioned. And actually, I'll just share one more. This just got cut out of the talk, but the first mention of chess actually comes with a mention of this coat of arms, which is the Marquess of Santa Cruz, and this was his coat of arms, and Girón is praising him and specifically describes this coat of arms as a chess set, and is talking about this as an emblem of honorable white Christian Spaniard bloodline. So we already have this association with chess in a heraldic sense with bloodline, and then when it gets refracted into the material, the luxury good of the chess set, and then also the body of the enslaved mulata Elvira, it seems like we're moving in a direction of racialization where this white and black is actually a mixture. And I think where I'm moving with this is actually, in fact, to resist that, because what we don't get really in this play is any sense that there is it's certainly not in admiration, a mixture. What we're getting is a reaffirmation that the children of Elvira will be black. Even though Girón says, my children will be like chess pieces, they will be white and black. But Elvira is the product of a black mother and a white father, and she is only described as black. And so there's this kind of negotiation within the play about, wait, what does this mean then? If Sevilla is a chessboard, if chessboards are associated with bloodline and so on and so forth, then how is it that we can make sense of this this particular interracial couple? And actually, I think Girón and the astrologer maybe are working with one line of thought, and then the rest of the play is kind of saying no. So I don't know. It may be that my thinking changes on that, but it certainly seems that in this play, this Spanish attitude is actually in tension. There's a lot of tension about what that Spanish attitude really is. And I have to put it back on the birth of Oshun because it's so beautiful. I didn't even say anything about it. It's just so gorgeous.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, especially as a follow-up to your answers right now. I mean, this is prompting me to think of Emily Weisbord's Bad Blood, right? And so thinking about, especially since you had mentioned chess being understood as a game of perfect information, right? One of Emily's arguments is that within Spain, the chessboard also symbolizes this idea of this fantasy of knowing, well, then for sure, if a person has a black complexion, then therefore they are not someone who has Jewish, right, conversion somewhere in the past, right? That somehow that aspect of religion, that there is this fantasy that therefore you don't have to worry about having a convert somewhere in your bloodline or having passed, right? So it's that fantasy. And so then that takes me now to Calvin, because you were mentioning your idea of racial mixture, right? And then Lope de Vega's play, right? But I'm curious therefore about Caliban. And mother hails from Algiers. She was pregnant. Did she become pregnant on that boat? Was she pregnant prior to the boat? I can't quite remember, but I'm curious if you could talk more about what you're seeing Lope de Vega doing, right, in terms of the black children that comes from a mixed race couple versus also the figure of Caliban and where potentially religion might come to play with Caliban, Algier, and yes, so many questions, but thank you so much for this very productive talk.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. That text, Bad Blood, one of the things that it does so brilliantly is it teases apart something that's actually come up several times over the past 2 days, which is the distinction between embodied racialization that is somatically versus non-somatically marked. And that's what I think she's doing so well in that book, is noting how this inquisitorial limpieza de sangre, modality is focused on these conversos as people that they cannot tell. They need to torture people to understand this, because even though it's rooted in this concept of blood, and even though it's rooted in this concept of blood and also associated with race, it is not somatically marked, as is the black and white that we get in that image of Sevilla as the chessboard. So I think, where I would really like to go is to think about how that racialization that is embodied but is both somatically and non-somatically marked works in a dynamic like Sevilla, where it's associated with this significant population of Black Africans, but of course it's within this much larger milieu of the Inquisition and limpieza de sangre itself. This whole phenomenon of the Indianos, that is creating that tension, because it's suggesting maybe we can just sort of look at someone and be able to tell where their blood comes from. The twist here, though, is that Elvira, the mulata, is always described as clean. Limpia is used to refer to her consistently throughout the play. So that's a whole, you'd be here all day. But that's another thing that kind of complicates this, which is why I really think that this is in tension in this play. With respect to Caliban, I think that's perhaps, pedagogically the easier thing to think about, because we do have this figure who is associated with various elements of the colonial enterprise. It's not made explicit, but he is associated with those spaces, Algiers, with this uninhabited island. He's made to kind of represent that combination or that pathway, much in the way that Elvira is, just much less explicitly. So I think that connection there, the enslavement, this notion of we kind of understand their parentage, but we don't fully understand their parentage, all of that I think makes those two figures very similar. And so then the gendered and sexual distinctions made between them become even more potent. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. This was just really amazing. The first thing that comes to mind is thank you, and especially for bringing Eurasia into the conversation. But what you were talking about with your mother, and I think that's the way mestizaje, even if you are mixed race, interpolates. But you're kind of showing how it's cyclical, coming from like this very present moment, like to very, very early. But in this, you're talking about caste designations, and I think that's one of the most vile things we see with Imperial Spain, is able to make this kind of like inventions that are so accepted, even though they're ultimately fictitious, and it's not just race, it's race, geography, and all these things. But as you were talking about mulata, and as you were talking about African and Afro-descended women who are looked at as suspect, and you bring curanderas into the conversation as well, I was wondering, because Prospero is also, with fair play, but he is a sorcerer. And so I'm wondering how much the caste system and these types of just fictions of racial designation were able not only to make blackness suspect, but in what way was it also working for us to ignore those type of, because it would be considered brujeria, right? For someone who was African descended to be practicing it. But for Prospero, did you come to any like legal history, and not just Prospero, but if we're just looking within this time frame, any legal histories or any historiography that kind of posits this like, I don't want to say binary because it transcends it for sure, but to render whiteness and brujeria not something that's suspect?
I'll give you the short answer first, which is no, I did not come across, and I have not looked into any of those sources or avenues you just suggested. 100% I'm going to do that, absolutely. But what's so exciting about that from my perspective is that, you know, the idea of bringing Rosales into this is because her work, when she's talking about Yoruba and she's talking about the migration of these African deities to the Americas, you know, if we're thinking about that and we're thinking about, you know, Caribbean interpretations like Santeria and so on, those are also these, I'm going to use the word and then I'm going to abandon the word, mixtures, right? It's a mixture of an African religion and you know, Catholic saints. But I think what's so powerful about her work, and this is how I think about this sort of imagining of the Caribbean in general, is that it's not about mixing. I hope it's more about, you know, using that as a foundation to rise, to create more beauty, to create more vivid beauty, to create more lasting beauty, and so on. And so I think what's exciting about what you're suggesting there is that the celebration of this magic, of this brujeria, which is not in Prospero, it is kind of leading us to consider, I mean, to some degree, he cannot bring that back with him. That is something that he also has to leave behind. And so perhaps we're getting just a little bit of a peek into, I don't know. I mean, now I'm getting into me arguing with my mom, which is like, I want to see myself here. I want to see myself in this place. Even though that place hates me, I want to see myself there. So, I don't know. Yeah, I love it. I love it. Thank you. Thank you.